The courtroom was supposed to be controlled, predictable, almost ritualistic. But on that day, it wasn't. The air inside was thick, not just with tension, but with something far more dangerous: consequence. The kind that doesn't just follow a man, but rewrites the system around him. Cameras weren't allowed inside. But outside, a storm was already building. Because at the center of it all stood a figure who had spent decades mastering power, influence, and narrative: Donald Trump. A man who had turned legal battles into political theater. A man who had survived scandal after scandal. A man who had convinced millions that the system could never truly touch him. Until now. Because this time, it wasn't just another lawsuit. This time, it was a reckoning measured not in headlines, but in millions of dollars. A court order, a financial strike, a public humiliation. And behind it all, a deeper question began to echo. Was this justice? Or was this the beginning of something much bigger? The moment didn't arrive suddenly. It built slowly, like pressure beneath the surface of the earth. Invisible at first, then undeniable. For years, Trump's business empire had operated in a gray zone, where aggressive tactics blurred into legal ambiguity. Inflated valuations, strategic declarations, deals that seemed to exist in two realities at once. One for lenders, another for taxes. To his supporters, it was brilliance. To his critics, it was deception. To the courts, it was evidence. And now, that evidence had reached its boiling point. Inside the courtroom, legal teams clashed not just over facts, but over narratives. Because this case wasn't just about money. It was about truth. What is a property worth? What is a brand worth? And more importantly, what happens when those numbers don't match reality? The judge's words, when they finally came, were precise, calculated, almost surgical. No shouting, no theatrics, just a verdict that cut straight through years of controversy. A financial penalty so large, it sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom walls. This wasn't just a fine. It was a message, a signal to markets, to political institutions, and to anyone watching closely. No one is untouchable, not even a former president. Outside, the reaction was instant. Supporters called it political persecution. Opponents called it accountability. But behind the noise, something more important was happening. Something quieter, but far more dangerous. Financial institutions were watching. Global investors were watching. Governments were watching. Because when a figure like Trump is hit with a massive financial judgment, it doesn't just affect one man. It sends ripples through the entire system. Through real estate markets. Through lending practices. Through the fragile trust that underpins modern capitalism. And suddenly, what looked like a courtroom drama started to look like a systemic event. Because here's the truth most people missed. This case was never just about Trump. It was about how wealth is measured, how power is leveraged, and how far the system is willing to go to correct itself. For decades, high-level finance operated on a simple, unspoken rule. As long as the machine keeps moving, nobody asks too many questions. But when the questions finally come, they don't just stop the machine, they expose it. And now, the exposure had begun. The ruling wasn't the end. It was the trigger. Because behind this million-dollar payback order lies a complex web of financial engineering, legal strategy, and political consequence. A system so intricate that most people never see it until it starts to collapse. The real story isn't the verdict. The real story is the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. And what happens when that system is forced into the light? Because what unfolded in that courtroom may not stay in that courtroom. It may spread into banks, into boardrooms, into the very structure of how power and money interact in America and beyond. And if that happens, this won't just be remembered as a legal case. It will be remembered as the moment everything began to shift. But to understand how we got here, you have to understand the system nobody was supposed to question. The system that made it all possible. And the hidden mechanics that turned numbers into power. And power into risk. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to step away from the courtroom. Because the real story didn't begin with a judge. It began with a system so normalized, most people never questioned it. A system where numbers weren't just numbers. They were leverage. They were influence. They were power. At the heart of it all lies one of the most misunderstood engines of modern wealth. Real estate finance. On the surface, it seems simple. You own a building. It has a value. That value determines how much you can borrow, how much you can invest, and how much you're worth. But beneath that surface, things get complicated. Because in high-level real estate, value is not fixed. It's flexible, and sometimes it's negotiable. Imagine this: the same property, the same walls, the same location, but two completely different numbers. One number presented to banks, showing massive value, stability, strength. Another number presented to tax authorities, showing reduced value, lower obligations, minimized costs. Two realities, one asset, and somewhere in between, a system that allows both to exist. For decades, this wasn't seen as unusual. It was seen as strategy. Developers, investors, and financial elites operated in a world where valuations could shift depending on context. Optimistic projections for lenders, conservative figures for tax purposes. And as long as no one pushed too hard, the system held. But here's the critical detail. This system depends on trust. Banks must trust the numbers they're given. Regulators must trust the disclosures they receive. Markets must trust that the foundation isn't built on illusion. And when that trust begins to crack, everything else follows. This is where Donald Trump enters the picture, not just as a political figure, but as a product of this system. For decades, his brand was built on one core idea: bigger, more valuable, more powerful than anyone else. Skyscrapers carrying his name, luxury properties marketed as symbols of success, a persona that blurred the line between perception and reality. And in many ways, that persona was the business model. Because in real estate, perception drives value, and value drives access. Access to loans, access to expansion, access to even greater influence. But what happens when perception is challenged? What happens when the numbers are no longer accepted at face value? That's when the system begins to turn on itself. In this case, investigators didn't just look at one transaction. They looked at patterns, years of financial statements, years of valuations that seemed to stretch beyond what independent assessments could justify. Properties that appeared to grow in value, not through market forces, but through internal declarations. Numbers that told a story, but not always the same story. And this is where things became dangerous. Because if those numbers were inflated for financial gain, it wasn't just aggressive strategy anymore. It became something else. Something that crossed a line the system had long avoided defining too clearly: fraud. But even that word doesn't fully capture the scale of what was at stake. Because this wasn't just about whether numbers were accurate. It was about whether the system itself had been quietly allowing these distortions for years, and whether exposing one case might expose many more. Think about it. If one high-profile figure is found to have manipulated valuations, what does that mean for others operating in the same environment? What does it mean for banks that approved loans? For auditors who signed off? For markets that absorbed those numbers without question? Suddenly, the focus shifts from one man to an entire structure. And that's what made this case different. It wasn't isolated. It was symbolic. A test of whether the system would protect itself or correct itself. Inside financial circles, the implications were immediate. Because if courts begin enforcing strict accountability on valuation practices, it changes everything. Lending becomes tighter. Risk assessments become harsher. Deals that once seemed routine suddenly look dangerous. And the very mechanism that fuels large-scale real estate expansion begins to slow down. But there's another layer, one that made this situation even more volatile: politics. Because this wasn't just a businessman under scrutiny. This was a former president, a man with millions of supporters, a man actively shaping the national conversation. And when legal accountability collides with political identity, the system doesn't just face pressure, it faces division. Supporters argued the rules were being selectively enforced, that what had long been tolerated was now being punished, not because it changed, but because the target had. Critics argued the opposite, that the system had been too lenient for too long, that accountability was overdue, and that this case was proof the rules still mattered. Between those two narratives, the truth became harder to see, but the consequences became impossible to ignore. Because once the system starts questioning itself, it doesn't stop at one case. It keeps going, deeper, wider, and often faster than anyone expects. And that's exactly what began to happen. What started as an investigation was now turning into a chain reaction, one that would move beyond courtrooms, into markets, institutions, and the very foundation of financial power. Because the moment trust is shaken, the collapse doesn't happen all at once. It spreads, quietly at first, then all at once. And in this case, the first cracks had already appeared. The only question was, how far would they go? At first, nothing seemed to happen. No sudden crash. No dramatic headlines declaring the system broken. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes experienced investors uneasy. Because in global finance, the most dangerous moments don't begin with noise. They begin with hesitation. Inside major financial institutions, something subtle started to shift. Risk departments, the quiet guardians of billion-dollar decisions, began asking different questions. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally, everything changed. Loans that would have been approved in weeks were now delayed. Valuations that once passed with minimal scrutiny were now dissected line by line. Assumptions were no longer accepted. They were challenged. And at the center of this shift was the same question echoing across boardrooms. If it happened here, where else could it be happening? The case surrounding Donald Trump had done something few legal battles ever achieve. It made the invisible visible. It exposed the fragile foundation beneath a system built on confidence, projections, and, at times, optimistic interpretations of value. And once that exposure happens, it cannot be undone. Banks, particularly those deeply embedded in commercial real estate, began quietly reassessing their portfolios. Not just Trump-related assets. Everything. Office towers, luxury developments, golf resorts, urban redevelopment projects. Anything tied to large-scale valuations. Because here's the reality most people don't see. The global real estate market isn't just built on physical structures. It's built on debt. Trillions of dollars of it. And that debt is justified by one thing: belief in value. But what happens when that belief weakens? What happens when lenders start to doubt the numbers they once trusted? The answer is simple. They pull back. And that's exactly what began to unfold. Credit tightened. Not dramatically at first, but enough to be felt. Developers who relied on continuous financing suddenly found doors closing. Refinancing deals became harder. Interest rates, already under pressure, became even more punishing when layered with uncertainty. Projects slowed. Some stopped entirely. This is how a financial shift begins. Not with collapse, but with contraction. And then came the second wave. Reputation risk. Because for institutions, the danger wasn't just financial. It was public. No bank wanted to be associated with questionable valuations. No executive wanted their decisions scrutinized in the next high-profile case. And no institution wanted to become the next headline. So they adapted. Quickly. Aggressively. Sometimes overcorrecting. Deals that once relied on aggressive projections were restructured or abandoned. Partnerships were reevaluated. Long-standing relationships became liabilities overnight. Because in moments like this, trust isn't just lost. It's recalculated. But the ripple effects didn't stop there. They spread into an even more sensitive area: insurance. Insurance companies, often overlooked in financial narratives, play a critical role in stabilizing large-scale assets. They insure properties, back loans, and provide the safety net that allows risk to exist in the first place. But insurance, like banking, depends on accurate assessments. And when those assessments come into question, so does coverage. Premiums began to rise. Policies became stricter. Some assets, particularly those tied to controversial valuations, faced new levels of scrutiny. In extreme cases, coverage became harder to secure. And without insurance, entire projects become unfinanceable. This is how pressure builds, layer by layer, sector by sector. Meanwhile, in the political arena, the situation was becoming even more volatile. Because what started as a legal and financial issue was now evolving into a national narrative. Supporters of Donald Trump saw the tightening system as proof of bias, a coordinated effort to dismantle not just a man, but a movement. Opponents saw it as long overdue accountability, a correction to years of unchecked behavior. And between those two perspectives, the system itself was being pulled apart. Regulators, caught in the middle, faced an impossible balancing act. Push too hard, and risk accusations of political targeting. Pull back, and risk appearing weak, complicit, or ineffective. But the reality was, they no longer had full control, because the chain reaction had already begun. Markets don't wait for political clarity. They react to risk. And risk, in this case, was spreading. Investors started demanding higher returns to compensate for uncertainty. Capital became more selective. Global funds, particularly those with exposure to U.S. real estate, began quietly diversifying, shifting assets, adjusting strategies, preparing for volatility. Not panic, preparation. And then came the most dangerous phase of all, contagion. Because once doubt enters a system built on confidence, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads across sectors, across borders, across institutions. A valuation questioned in one case leads to scrutiny in another. A loan denied in one deal affects expectations in the next. A single legal ruling begins to reshape an entire industry's behavior. This is how collapse begins, not as a single event, but as a process. And yet, to the average person watching the news, it still looked like a story about one man, one courtroom, one financial penalty. But beneath the surface, the system was shifting, quietly, relentlessly, because the real impact of this moment wasn't the millions ordered in court. It was the trillions now being reconsidered. And as the pressure continued to build, one thing became clear: this wasn't going to stay contained. The shockwave was coming. And when it hit, it would reach far beyond real estate. At some point, pressure stops building quietly. It erupts. What began as hesitation inside banks turned into visible strain across the broader economy. Not overnight, but fast enough that those paying attention could see the pattern forming. Because once credit tightens in real estate, it doesn't stay there. It spreads outward into construction, employment, investment, and ultimately into everyday life. Developers were the first to feel it. Projects that once symbolized growth, high-rise towers, luxury complexes, sprawling resorts, suddenly became liabilities. Financing dried up, costs surged, and timelines collapsed. Construction firms began slowing operations. Some paused projects indefinitely, others canceled them entirely. And with each delay came consequences. Contractors lost work. Suppliers saw orders disappear. Local economies, built around these developments, started to feel the vacuum. Because real estate isn't just about buildings. It's about ecosystems. Jobs, materials, services, financing, all interconnected. And when one part stalls, everything else follows. Meanwhile, banks found themselves trapped in a dangerous position. On one side, they needed to protect themselves from risk. On the other, they couldn't afford to choke the system that generated their profits. So they walked a tightening rope, issuing fewer loans, demanding stronger guarantees, increasing scrutiny. But every restriction had a cost. Less lending meant less growth. Less growth meant weaker returns. And weaker returns meant rising pressure from investors. This is where the shockwave intensified, because now the effects weren't just operational. They were financial. Commercial real estate valuations began to wobble. Not collapse, not yet, but weaken. And in markets driven by confidence, even a small shift can trigger massive consequences. Because when valuations drop, loan-to-value ratios change. Borrowers suddenly owe more relative to what their assets are worth. Refinancing becomes harder. Defaults become more likely. And that's when fear enters the system. Global investors, always watching, always calculating, began adjusting their positions. Funds with exposure to U.S. real estate quietly pulled back. Capital flowed into safer assets. Risk appetite shrank. What looked like a domestic legal issue was now influencing international financial behavior. At the same time, political pressure began to escalate. Because economic strain doesn't stay confined to boardrooms. It reaches voters, workers, communities. And as projects stalled and uncertainty grew, political leaders were forced to respond. Some called for stricter regulation, arguing that the system had allowed too much flexibility for too long. Others warned that overcorrection could trigger a deeper crisis, one that would hurt not just elites, but ordinary people. Caught in the middle of it all was a single, undeniable reality. The system was fragile, far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. And looming over this entire situation was the figure who had triggered it, Donald Trump. Because regardless of perspective, whether seen as a victim, a disruptor, or a symbol, his case had become the catalyst, the moment that forced the system to look at itself. And once that process begins, There is no easy way back, but every crisis has a moment, a turning point, a realization. The instant when those in power understand. This is bigger than we thought. And for this story, that moment was coming. Fast. Part 5. The humiliating moment / turning point. It didn't happen in public. There was no dramatic press conference. No single headline that captured it. But behind closed doors, in offices, in government buildings, in executive boardrooms, the tone changed. Sharply. Because the implications of the ruling were no longer theoretical. They were real, immediate, and potentially uncontrollable. Financial leaders began asking urgent questions. What if this expands? What if more cases follow? What if the system itself is forced into a level of transparency it was never designed to handle? At the same time, political strategists faced a different kind of fear. Because this wasn't just about economics anymore. It was about perception, control, narrative. For supporters of Donald Trump, the ruling became a rallying cry, evidence of a system targeting a powerful outsider. For opponents, it became validation, proof that accountability could still reach the highest levels. And in that divide, the risk intensified, because when legal outcomes become political symbols, they stop being contained. They spread. Quiet negotiations began, not necessarily between obvious enemies, but between institutions trying to stabilize the situation. Banks coordinating with regulators, advisors working to manage exposure, political figures attempting to control the narrative before it spiraled further. But beneath all of it, there was a deeper realization, one that few wanted to say out loud. The system had allowed itself to drift too far, too flexible, too dependent on perception over precision. And now, correcting it would come at a cost. That cost wasn't just financial. It was reputational, institutional, even geopolitical. Because when the world's largest economy shows signs of internal financial strain, the entire global system pays attention. And that's when the true weight of the moment hit. Not just for one man, but for everyone connected to the system he represented. This wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a signal, a warning, a shift. And once that shift begins, there's no guarantee where it ends. Part 6. The future and final warning. The courtroom is quiet now. The ruling has been delivered. The headlines have moved on. But the consequences are still unfolding. Because what happened here was never just about a financial penalty. It was about exposure. Exposure of a system built on flexibility, on interpretation, on the delicate balance between ambition and accuracy. And now that exposure has created a new reality. One where institutions are more cautious, where valuations are more scrutinized, where risk is no longer hidden beneath confidence. But here's the deeper question. Does this make the system stronger or more fragile? Because tightening controls can restore trust, but it can also slow growth, reduce opportunity, trigger unintended consequences. And in a global economy already facing uncertainty, that balance becomes critical. For Donald Trump, the story is far from over. Legal battles will continue. Narratives will evolve. Supporters and critics will keep fighting over what this moment means. But beyond the individual, the system has changed. Banks will remember this. Investors will remember this. Regulators will remember this. And perhaps most importantly, those operating within the gray areas of finance will remember this. Because the message has been sent, clearly, powerfully, and with consequences that cannot be ignored. No system is untouchable. No structure is immune. And no matter how strong the illusion of control may seem, reality always finds a way to break through. The question now isn't whether this moment mattered. It's how far its impact will reach. Because if this was the beginning of a broader correction, then what we've seen so far is only the first chapter, and the next one may be even more disruptive.